Hello there. My name is Gerald Higa, and welcome to MiliMoe SciFi, where I'm going to talk a little bit about writing science fiction and themes in writing science fiction. The first topic I thought I'd cover was sort of politics in sci-fi worlds. Now, usually when people think about uh, sort of science fiction, the last thing on their mind is politics. But politics are sort of the backdrop by which a lot of stories are told. My particular favorite genre is actually military science fiction, and military science fiction is extremely driven by politics. If you like anything that has space empires or sort of intrigue between planets, that all anything that has to do with the interaction between groups, then politics actually plays a pretty big role in all of that. And so today I'd like to talk a little bit about how we think about politics when you're creating sci-fi worlds. Now, when we think about technology, it's really easy to say, well, okay, when I'm going to write technology, let's say that my story is set 200 years in the future. Well, then, when I write my story, I'm going to project, in terms of technology, what I think technology is going to be like in 200 years. Now, it may or may not be more advanced than it currently is, but the idea is that we are going to evolve. Technology is going to evolve along some path, typically forward, sometimes backwards, but most of the time we're thinking of this as sort of forward progress. That's why we're interested in science fiction in the first place. And in other cases, we might even think sort of from a more philosophical point of view, and some science fiction authors even go as far as to think that human nature has evolved over time, and that human nature will also progress. Um, let's say that if we go 200 or 2,000 years into the future, that we will become different and hopefully better. Yet, a lot of times when we think about science fiction, one of the last things we think about are politics. But really, in the same way that technology and everything else evolves, we have to think about politics evolving too. If we think about the politics from even 100 years ago in the United States, as an example, I'm an American, um, it actually looks dramatically different. The politics of 1920 look pretty different from the politics of 2020. Then, if I go back another 100 years to, let's say, 1820, it looks even more different. And if we go back to 1720, it's even more different. So, a mere 300 years in time, we can see such a dramatic change in terms of politics. So, imagine now if we project 100 years into the future, or 200 years into the future, or 300 years into the future. We might think, now, for familiarity's sake, we might think of it as basically being the same type of government and the same type of politics that we see in the in the world today in 2020. But I think that when we're creating science fiction worlds, we really do need to think about what the implications are of whatever universe that we've created. So imagine um, if we were talking about a world, let's say, where there's faster than light travel, and that it is now multiplanetary or even a multi-stellar society. Well, maybe the analog of projecting our contemporary politics in the future isn't going to quite work out. For instance, um, imagine that even though we might have faster than light travel, it certainly doesn't mean that we're going to have instantaneous travel. And if we don't have instantaneous travel, we probably also don't have instantaneous communication. So right now, in terms of planet Earth, the worst communication lag that we can see between one side of the Earth to another might be a few seconds, right? So, for all intents and purposes, at the scale of politics, maybe not necessarily the scale of all human interactions, but certainly at the sort of scale of human politics, a few seconds delay is almost inconsequential. So therefore, we can Earth politics have kind of evolved with this almost instantaneous sense. But that wasn't always the case, right? If we can imagine before we had telecommunications and before we had satellites, communication was much slower, and that had a profound effect on politics. So if we imagine projecting 2020 politics into the future, that may not be the case if we have a starfaring civilization where um, The fastest form of communication may be putting a message on a ship and sending a ship faster than light from one planet to another. Under those circumstances, or even circumstances where somehow you have faster than light communication, anything short of instantaneous communication means that the time communicating, let's say even between planets, may not just be a matter of seconds, but maybe a matter of minutes, hours, days, maybe even years, right? So, and you can imagine if communication were to happen at that pace, that would fundamentally change sort of the political relationship between planets. Certainly, you might gather, if we use analogs from sort of contemporary industrial countries, that you have some sort of parliament or a governmental body where representatives from all these different parts of the political entity meet together and try to make political decisions. In a star spanning civilization, that might be extremely difficult. And even when decisions are made, the communication of those decisions may take a very long time. They could take weeks, they could take months. And given that circumstance, even within our star system, you can imagine traveling at the speed of light, information could take hours, or even up to a day for the information to make a round trip. So it would make communication extremely difficult, and the longer that distance is, and the longer that gap in time, we could conceive of a politics evolving where there's a lot more local autonomy. For instance, if let's say that there is a galactic empire or a galactic republic, however you want to look at it, and there's a legislative body, even if they make some kind of ruling that affects all the planets in this governmental system, one could imagine that the propagation of that information could take weeks or months. And under those circumstances, that means local authorities would have a lot of leeway and a lot of sort of local authority. And so, even in a sense that we might have a democratic system, maybe it won't be quite the same kind of democracy at the same scale that we think of, where we just substitute states for planets, in the United States as an example, right? Or provinces for planets. It might be a far more complex relationship. And think about this. Imagine a planet-wide government. There may not be a unified planet-wide government, and yet this planet may be sending a representative to a overarching political entity that's light years away. The complexities that just from this one problem, the complexities and the implications that that has for politics are pretty substantial. Forget about if the fact that we might have extraterrestrials or anything else that are common sort of themes of science fiction. All of these things, you know, if you're if a science fiction world that you're creating or that you're involved and interested in doesn't really deal with this, it's understandable. But it does provide the context and sort of background for whatever kind of inter organizational conflict that might exist in the science fiction universe, right? So it's something that, although we might not put it in the forefront, someone still needs to kind of think about these issues. And that's like, for instance, when I write my own science fiction, I'm always acutely aware of the fact that I have to think about the fact that a governmental system in 2,000 years from now may be just as alien to us as a governmental system from from basically 0 AD or 20 AD or 10 or 20 BC. You can imagine that while it's recognizable and perhaps understandable, it's not easily relatable. That there's enough of a gap in time where things and systems might be quite different. I think it's a little bit naive to assume, and there was a political theory about this. I do have a political science background, both undergraduate and as PhD, but that somehow we'd reached an end of history, that because of sort of market economics and liberal democracies, there would be no other development of government. And I don't think that that's true. I think that all of these political, social, economic systems can still evolve. And that's actually part of the fun of being a science fiction writer, that we can imagine or think about how these systems might evolve. Now, it may not be the focal point of your story, but I think it would still be an interesting thing to consider. Now, again, when I say politics in sci-fi worlds, your first instinct may be, well, that's got to be the driest subject around. I will tell you that a lot of political scientists were motivated and interested in studying politics because of science fiction. Um, if you've ever read good old Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, you'll find that the psychohistorian and Harry Seldon um, actually has a lot of resonance with political scientists. I was actually at a conference for political scientists, and we were sitting around, and I was a newly minted professor at the time, so I was a little bit green, and so some of the other professors at this conference, we were sitting around chatting after an academic session, and they said, "So, what got you interested in political science?" So I kind of said, "Well, this is a little weird, but I really love psychohistory from Foundation series," and we went around, and multiple people in that group said, "Me too, me too, me too." And so it was really surprising to me. And that was the first time, I guess, kind of in a casual setting, that I had talked to other political scientists. And a lot of them had actually been motivated by science fiction to go in and study political science. So, in the same way, I think that we always think of science fiction as motivating people to become engineers or to become scientists in the physical sciences. I think it's also possible to think about the connections between politics and science fiction, and political science and science fiction. So, this is just hopefully the first in a series of videos that I'd like to make discussing different topics in science fiction. The explanation of the name MiliMoe is actually based on sort of a Japanese sub fandom of science fiction. Mili obviously being military, and moe being sort of a love of cute characters. So there is a whole subgenre uh, in Japanese fandom where there's basically military stories. Now, they may be historical, like World War II style stories, or they may be contemporary military stories, or there may be science fiction. But basically, the idea that there's a combination of sort of this military themes with cute characters. As you can see, this picture behind me is basically from the cover from the book that I wrote, Distant Children. And as you can see, I like the genre, in this case, it's a very specific subgenre, which is MiliMoe, but MiliMoe for science fiction. So anyway, I like to sort of do this. This is an experiment. I have a day job. This is as a game designer. But I thought that it would be interesting for me to talk about different subjects in science fiction that I found interesting about how to create worlds. So, if you are a game designer, if you, in my case, I'm a narrative game designer, but if you also role play, or if you're a writer, or you have an interest in science fiction, hopefully the topic talking about some of these topics will be interesting to you. Now, I'm not in the case of political science, I think I have a little bit more authority than in other places. There are going to be times when I'm going to talk about physics, or I'm going to talk about other areas that probably are a little bit out of my scope. So please feel free to comment, and if it's interesting, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much.